Have you ever tried to make a change in your life? And it always goes perfectly, right? Just like I planned, right? That we were hoping, maybe we want to be more productive. Maybe there's a habit that we're trying to break free from. But so often when we try to make changes, how does it go? That so often when we try to make those changes, we kind of go back to where we were. We kind of find ourselves kind of stuck. That there's somehow there seems to be something in us that no matter how much we want to change, we find that making a change is hard, that we have a tendency to kind of stay wherever we already are. And we find that that's true in kind of big things and little things, big life things, but even small things. As I've been going through working on this series, I've been thinking a lot about the changes in my life that led me to move from a place like New York City, which shockingly is different than New Hampshire, to New Hampshire. And that's been over 20 years for me now. But, last week I kind of talked about kind of hiking experience I had. This week I have a climbing story for you. I'm not that outdoorsy. I'm compressing 30 years into a couple of weeks. I'm not that outdoorsy, not really. But when I was living in New York City, where I worked, now this is the early 90s. I'm like 25 years old, 27 years old, something like that. And where I'm at, they opened a climbing gym. Now, rock climbing gyms are pretty prolific these days. But in the early 90s, they weren't, particularly on the East Coast in an urban area. So there's this rock climbing gym, and I went, and I just fell in love with it. And my nature is to be obsessive, right? So I kind of went all the time, climbing all the time. Loved the climbing gym, so I wanted to go outside. So about 90 minutes outside of New York, there's a place called New Paltz that you can kind of go out and do rock climbing. Now that was fun, loved that. Now most of the cliffs I climbed there were smaller, more like 50 feet high, 70 feet high, that kind of stuff. So somebody told me the best place to find larger cliffs on the East Coast, or at least the Northeast, is New Hampshire. So I came up to New Hampshire. It was actually one of my first visits to New Hampshire some 30 years ago. And I came, and the first time I was climbing one of the larger cliffs. I'm up by North Conway. I'm up there on Cathedral Ledge. If you climb at all, you know that area. And for my first time, I'm on like a 300-foot high cliff. Now, just in case you're wondering, 300 is bigger than 50, right? So around 200 feet up, so the terminology is you're 200 feet off the deck, right? So I'm about 200 feet off the deck. And as I'm climbing up, I'm getting kind of tired, and you do it in segments. And I reached, in climbing terms, what was a ledge. Now, ledge in this term means that it's about 2 inches wide, right? But it's actually way better than the rest of the face. And I'm not very skilled. I'm still pretty new at this. So I'm getting pretty tired. So I kind of get to the ledge, and I take a rest. Now, a 2-inch wide ledge is a place where you can rest, but it's not a place where you can live. And apparently I decided I wanted to live there. Because, after you take a break, what you have to do is you have to now take this relatively secure thing that you're standing on and step away from it. You have to. I couldn't. There's a term in climbing called gripped, if you ever heard that, where you are literally so afraid that you physically can't move. It's actually pretty common. Particularly for people who are the first time 200 feet off the deck, right, sort of thing. And I was gripped with fear. Now, there's no staying there, right? That I know I can't stay there. And you can't climb back down. Down climbing 200 feet is going to be way worse than all the other choices. So the only thing to do is settle down and take a step. Because you know that where you are is not really where you want to be. It's comfortable because it's familiar, but it's not a place you can stay. And in my case, a big part of what got me kind of ungripped was that there was a more experienced climber with me who kind of knew what to do, knew what to say. They kind of settled me down, also pointed out that I can't stay there, sort of thing. But finally he got me through it, and it's one of those funny things too is that first step is utterly terrifying because you're looking down, you realize you weren't born for this sort of thing. But then once you start, it gets a bit easier. It doesn't mean it's easy, but that first step in the right direction, which for me was out and up, is what got me moving again. And I'm pretty sure that that kind of experience is not limited to rock climbing. Right? That's kind of what happens in our lives. Right? In our lives, we often find ourselves in a place we don't really want to be, but the thought of changing feels like it's too much, and we can't move on. So this week, as we continue our series, Healing What Hurts, what I want to talk about today is taking a step in the right direction. Now remember that our point in this series is that there is a very real thing that I believe is true for all of us. That we all have unresolved issues in our lives, right? We all have hurts and pains and experiences that we have never fully processed, because sometimes it's just too hard to process. And what happens, though, is that if we don't deal with those things, if we don't go through the process, sometimes a very difficult process of dealing with those things, we're going to be trapped, we're going to be stuck. Because as long as we have unresolved pain, unresolved issues inside of us, we're never going to really live that life that we're capable of living. I'll say this a couple times today. You were created to do incredible things. No matter what age you are, no matter what stage of life you're in, you were created to do incredible things, and you still have incredible things in front of you, even as you deal with the difficulties of life that come along. But there is this, I often call it a gravity. There's a gravity that kind of seems to pull us and hold us into the place where we're at, even if we know it's not really working. Because we kind of convince ourselves that at least I know I can do this. If I try to do that, it might not work. And we leave ourselves a bit stuck. So last week we kind of talked about the first steps in kind of beginning to deal with this pain and with these difficulties. Right? We talked about the fact that that first step is acknowledging that we actually have the pain. That one of the things as a human race that we're really good at is convincing ourselves that we're fine. No, I'm fine. No, really, I'm fine, right? Sort of thing. And we're not fine, right? There are things bubbling up in us, but we think because we can push them down, that we've got a handle on them. The reality is that we need to acknowledge that there's more going on, and there's something we need to do to get free. And one of the things we talked about is that a big part of achieving that is inviting God into the process. That we tend to think that I'll tough it out, I'll figure it out by myself, I'll get there on my own. And we can't really heal all alone. So if we invite God into the process, we begin to see something happen. But also we talked about the fact that God works through other people, other experiences. So when we go through a process of healing, that we want to use all the tools that are made available. Right? Things like recovery groups, things like support groups, doctors, counselors. We use all those things. We don't do no, I'm just praying to get better. Right? The wisdom the doctors have, the wisdom the counselors have, the things that go on in support groups, those things are all gifts from God. We use those things so we can get better. But then one of the things we talked about last week as well is that in addition to all those things, that we do need to acknowledge that we have a role in our current situation. That there are things that we're doing that we may need to change. And we talked about that last week, and we looked at the fact that doing that can make a difference. So I want to really kind of build on that idea this week. And if you didn't see last week, I'd encourage you to go out to the website and check that out, because it really kind of builds some of the foundations. But the reality is that if we're going to experience healing, it is a process. We have to do things. And part of that is making changes in our lives. That unless your life is absolutely perfect, and if so, I am truly happy for you. But I think most of us could make changes in our lives that would make our lives a little bit better. You know, and they can be big or small things, right? We can do things to improve our productivity. We can spend more quiet time to settle ourselves, to identify the triggers that set us off. But we also understand that as we go through changes in our lives, you know, there are things we might want to add, right? There are things we might want to subtract that may be not so good for us. And we also have to understand that every person in your life may not be good for you. That there are times in our lives where it makes sense to be distanced from certain people. Now, that's not that we don't love them and we don't care for them, but sometimes love is best at a distance. Right? There are people who trigger us. Right? There are people who are abusive towards us. There are people who use us. You know, and there's sometimes that there's just habits that we're wrestling with that we want to get free of, and those people don't support us. And those are all people we need to keep a distance from. But no matter what the change is that we're trying to make in our lives, whether it's adding things, subtracting things, dealing with people, making a change is hard. Right? Just like stepping off that cliff for me was really, really hard. A cliff, ledge, right? Trying to step off that was really hard. Making changes for us is really hard. And the thing is, whether you're talking about rock climbing being stuck, or talking about being stuck in life in the sense that I can't make a change that I need to make, that I can't add something I need to add, there are a number of reasons that might be behind that, but I think they all boil down to one thing. Whether it's rock climbing or life, it's fear. Fear. Fear is the thing that keeps us stuck. I mean, for me on that rock, it was literally very conscious fear of falling. Right? Even though I know there were safety systems in place, I wasn't really going to fall. I mean, I'd fall a little bit, but I wouldn't hit the deck sort of thing. I was going to be fine. Because it's okay to fall sometimes. Right? But it's that same fear, or very similar fear, when we try to make changes. It's that fear that keeps us from making those changes. And whether it's the side of a cliff or just a new habit or thing you're trying to add, that fear is equally real. And that fear has to be overcome. And fear doesn't go away by accident. In order to get free of our fears, it has to be intentional. Right? We actually have to make a conscious effort to conquer our fears, to move past our fears. And this idea of fear keeping us from changing, introducing healthy changes into our lives, there are a few reasons or a few triggers for that fear, but there's one I want to talk about today. And that's fear of failing to meet expectations. That we all carry expectations. We're all a bit concerned about what people think of us. Now, I've had conversations like this with people many times over the years, and what's the automatic response? I don't care what anybody thinks. I do what I want. Everybody cares what somebody thinks. Right? Some people may actually have that issue where they're very concerned about what the kind of general population thinks, and that's really hard for people. That it's a very difficult thing to live with. But I don't really have that issue, but there's certainly people I care about what they think of me. I care about what you guys think of me. Right? You know, we all have people in our lives that we care about what they think of us. And so, what do we do? I mean, I think the first thing that we need to do is kind of think about what is the expectation that's kind of holding you down? What's the expectations that are kind of keeping you from doing what you need to do? Because again, those expectations can be coming from, I just don't want to fall down in front of people. But as I said, they're more commonly more specific than that. You know, it might be a group of people, you know, a peer group, you know, people in your, a group you're a part of, a club you're a part of, that sort of thing. You know, it might be a family member, right? A parent, a sibling. But the thing to remember, though, is that we can be held down by expectations of people who aren't even around anymore. The people who are not in our lives anymore. People who might not even be alive anymore. Because expectations occupy our mind, right? Because over time, things happen, and those things form us, particularly things that happen when we're young. And things that happen to us, especially when we're young, they form not just our view of the world, they form how we view ourselves. So if you had a parent who was really harsh or difficult or talked to you kind of really in a bad way, or hard way, I should say, a hard way, or maybe didn't engage with you enough, or a sibling, or a teacher, or a coach, or just somebody you respected who kind of dealt with you in a really hard way, that starts to form things inside of you. Or maybe when you were young, you tried to step way out, and you did something that was way outside your comfort zone, and it didn't work out. And everybody around you, or at least it felt to you like everybody around you, said, why did you even try? You knew you couldn't do that. You knew you were going to fail. Why did you even do that? Those things stick with us. And you don't have to be a kid for that stuff to hurt. Right? Even as an adult, an abusive relationship, a traumatic experience, those things form how we engage with ourselves. Those things impact our self-esteem. They impact how we talk to ourselves. Because what we often find is that even when a person is no longer part of your life, or even after an event is well into our past, oftentimes that voice from that person still plays in our head. We can still hear the terrible things they said to us. And not only do we hear the things that they said to us, but, and I'll speak from my own life, because I had a really abusive family member, that they start to form that voice that you talk to yourself with. That all those things they used to say to you, you say it for them now. Right? In your head, when you're thinking about doing something, you hear all the things they said to you, but you don't hear it in their voice anymore. You hear it in your voice. Because those experiences formed the way we interact with ourselves, the way we engage with ourselves. So what happens? When we get ready to make a change, when we start to step out, the first time it doesn't go as smooth as we hoped it would be, the first time we thought we could do something and it just didn't quite work, what happens? All those years of all those things they've said now play in your voice, in your head, at full speed over and over again. And you start to believe that, you know what, when it falls short, I'm a complete failure. It's never going to work. I'm never going to get any better at this. It's never going to happen. That's all it's ever going to be. And if you don't hear anything else I say today, I want you to hear this, that voice is lying to you. That our failures do not define us. There's an old saying that I absolutely love. Failure is an event, not a person. Right? When we try new things, we get it wrong sometimes. You know what? This may be a shock to you, but life is hard. Right? That's a joke. Just I realized it was getting kind of heavy. I wanted to make a light joke. It didn't work, clearly. All right, sorry. Clearly, well, now it's funny, right? But the reality is life is hard, man. Life is hard. We get it wrong. I think we're kind of supposed to get it wrong. I mean, the things that most shape us are the things we get wrong. Right? How do we learn anything? We do things we don't know how to do. We do it wrong, and then we try again, and we do it better. And somehow that seems to be okay in things like mathematics or mechanics or other things. But we don't give ourselves that break when it comes to life. Well, life is more complicated than all those things. And so we need to have the freedom to recognize that life is something to be figured out. It's not meant to be perfectly planned. I mean, yes, you set plans and you have goals, but you know what? Sometimes it just don't work out. That's okay. You just try again. But in order to do that, we have to start to get free from that voice, and more generally, we have to start to get free from expectations. The expectations we put on ourselves, the expectations that other people have put on us, those expectations from other people that we carry with us. So, does that mean if we're not going to be subject to expectations of other people, does that mean we never listen to anybody else? That we just kind of, never think it through, we don't run it through our own mind? I mean, if I didn't listen to anybody else, 30 years later, I'd still be on a cliff in North Conway, sort of thing. But a guy there who I trusted, had a relationship with, talked me off the cliff, right? He literally talked me off the ledge, sort of thing, right? So I could go back up. So we want to be able to listen to other people, and we certainly have to hear that voice in our minds. I mean, that's how we talk to ourselves. That's how we process things, right? Those are good things. So how do we identify what to listen to and what not to listen to? What is good advice and what's bad advice? What are reasonable expectations and what are unreasonable expectations? Well, I think that we can actually get some insight from revisiting the narrative we went through last week. Now remember, that narrative we walked through last week came to us from the Apostle John. Right? So the Apostle John was one of the folks who traveled with Jesus. And if you recall, in that narrative, John and the other disciples were traveling with Jesus. They come to the city of Jerusalem. And they come to the temple area where people gathered. And they went to this area where there were many, many people with illnesses and ailments and so forth. And John told us that there was this one guy there who had had an ailment for a very long time, for decades. And Jesus approached the guy, and he talked to the guy. and he brought healing into the guy's life. But if you recall the narrative, first Jesus brought the initial healing into the guy's life, but then what did Jesus do after that? He says, okay, now that you're doing better, recognize that there are things in your life you need to change. Walk through that. Do that process of changing, introducing changes into your life. That's how you will have a fuller life. I've gotten you started, but now continue changing and healing. And so that was advice from Jesus, and that turned out to be good advice. So it's another example of good advice. So we see more good advice. So how do we identify the bad advice? How do we identify the bad expectations? Well, it turns out that in that narrative, there's not just John, Jesus, and the man. There's some other folks around as well. And as we'll see as we dig into it, that those other folks have some expectations. And Jesus is completely unimpressed with their advice and expectations. So just to remind kind of how things went last week, John told us that Jesus told this man, the man who had been sick for many decades, to stand up, pick up your mat, and walk. You're free, right? You move on. Take that thing and take it with you, sort of thing. Instantly, the man was healed. He rolled up his sleeping mat, and he began walking. It's a great story, right? But then John continues. He tells us, but this miracle happened on the Sabbath. So the Jewish leaders objected, or we might say the religious leaders objected. They said to the man he was cured, you can't work on the Sabbath. The law doesn't allow you to carry that sleeping mat. Loss of perspective, anyone? Right? This guy had been ailing for decades. People would have likely known him. They certainly would have known of him. And they'd known he'd been ill for a long time. But what's happening? Something amazing has happened. A human's life is now better. But what's their focus? Expectations. You're not allowed to do that. Well, I couldn't walk 5 minutes ago. I'm going to walk now. I'm going to carry my mat. Right? But they're being judgmental. They're telling me what he's doing is wrong. And I want to be really clear, because this is often a confusing point, that in the Old Testament, the guidance given by God, or actually the rule given by God, was that the Sabbath day is not a day to work. But one of the things that Jesus clarified was that the thing about not working was just that, about not working. That one day a week, which was actually breakthrough in the ancient world. In the ancient world, people worked 7 days a week. And the command to the Hebrews was, well, no, bless you, was that I'm going to ask you to take 1 day a week and just not work. Trust me, things will be okay. Take 1 day, don't work, spend time with your family, rest, and spend some time in worship. That's what the original edict was. But over time, the religious leaders kept digging into it and started coming up with these definitions of work. Well, what is work? Well, that answer is pretty clear, right? I know when I'm at work and I know when I'm not, sort of thing. But the religious leaders started layering all this sort of things. How many steps can you take in a day and not call it work? And one of the rules is that you literally can't carry a mat. That was actually a rule. That was never the intent of the Sabbath. The intent of the Sabbath was rest, recovery, and connection. That was its intent. But the expectation of the religious leaders, or the expectation they had layered on, were these other things that were not helpful. Now think about it. This is the happiest day of this guy's life. I think I can say that with confidence, that after decades of having some physical ailment where he could not walk, and in that world that meant he could not actually work, he could not earn a living, now he can. And think of the victory. Think of this idea of the Ebenezer, that thing that reminds you that God shows up. For how many years had he laid on that mat? For how many years had that mat been a symbol of the fact that he was not healthy, not able to live his life as he wants to? And in an instant, that mat became the symbol of what God had done in his life. He had that reminder of, you know what, I thought it would never get any better. But now, every time he looks at that, he remembers that he used to have to lay on it, but now he's free to carry it. I mean, think of the joy that would have been in his heart at that moment. And what do these religious leaders do? They walk up and tell him he's wrong. They start giving him a hard time. But he has a response. He says, the man who healed me told me, pick up your mat and walk. In other words, if somebody does something like that in my life, I'm going to listen to what he says. He said, pick up your mat and walk. And I really think that Jesus was really trying to make a point here. That used to be the thing that reminded you that you were not well. But now it's a thing to remind you that you are well now. Embrace that. But then, even with all that going on, we see how much the expectation of these religious leaders has lost its perspective. Because their only response after the man says that is, well, who said such a thing? In other words, I'm sorry, that doesn't meet our expectations. I don't care what it means to you. That doesn't meet our expectations. Now think about it, that this is the first century. This is 2,000 years ago. Right? Medicine at that time did not exist as we know it. So there was no medical solution that would lead to this experience in this man's life. This was something amazing. But these religious leaders looked right past what was amazing, right past this man's changed life, and just focused on their expectations. Not even congratulations, but knock it off. Right? They couldn't even say that. All they focused on is what you're doing is wrong. Now it's interesting if we think about this all the way. This man who couldn't walk by carrying his mat had failed to meet the religious leaders' expectations. And Jesus, by having the nerve to heal someone on the Sabbath, oh my goodness, doing good on the day God set aside for doing good, didn't meet their expectations. So Jesus failed to meet their expectations. And we have to remember that in the first century, these religious leaders had a tremendous amount of power, that they kept people hopping from one foot to another, always kind of keeping people concerned that they weren't meeting the religious leaders' expectations. In fact, much of their power came from the fact that people were always very concerned about falling short on their expectations. And it turns out that telling this man that he's wrong was not enough for these religious leaders. They decided they had to get to the bottom of this. Who is this guy who's doing good on the Sabbath and making people's lives better? Who is that? And they actually go out and start harassing the man. Excuse me, they go out and start harassing Jesus, I'm sorry. So they go out and they actually start harassing Jesus. So they actually take the time to track him down and start telling him that he has failed to meet their expectations. How concerned do you think Jesus was? Not at all. Because as we look at what Jesus says back to them, and this is the key point of the message right here, what I'm about to say, or what Jesus is about to say, is that he shows us how to tell good expectations from bad. How do we know whether what someone is advising us with is good or it's bad? So basically, they start harassing him, and Jesus says, your approval means nothing to me, because I know you don't have God's love in you. That's the point. That's it right there. When you're trying to do something, when you're trying to make a change, when you're making a move, that voice that's giving you advice, whether that voice originates internally in our own minds or from people outside of us, does that voice come from love? Now, we have to be careful about that, because there are people who love in very unhealthy ways. So when we say, does it come from love, we don't use an arbitrary measure of love. Does it come from God's love? And when I say God's love, does it come from a place of God's love as demonstrated by Jesus? A patient love, an accepting love, a love that wants more for you than you have today, a love that's willing to sacrifice one's own desires to make your life better, because that's what Jesus did. And so Jesus is saying that that is the measure of whether I bother to listen to what someone tells me I should do, what advice they have, what expectations I should consider. And in that, I believe that Jesus is giving us the model that we should measure those things by. That when people speak into our lives, that we need to hear what they say, but then we have to decide, is this truly coming from love as Jesus demonstrated love? Because if it doesn't, I don't think it should even be considered. Now, it doesn't mean that we take all other advice, because things can come from a place of love and still not be correct. But then you talk through that, because if it's really from love, you can really talk about it and you can really work it out. And people start telling you to do things and don't let you ask questions, don't let you dig in deeper, don't let you challenge the concept, that's not coming from a place of love. And when that voice in your head starts to play, saying that, don't do this, you're just going to fail anyway. Why would you even think you could do this? Or when it actually does go wrong, see, I told you, you always do it like this. Does that sound like a voice of love playing in your head? And that's what Jesus is pointing out for us here, is that we need to put that filter. That needs to be the first filter on everything we hear, in our own minds or from the people around us. That's how we measure it. Does it come from that kind of love? To kind of close it out, so often the fear of what will happen if I make a change keeps us from trying to make a change, which leaves us stuck. We basically convince ourselves that as dysfunctional as this environment is, I feel like I've figured it out, I'm just going to stay here. You were created for so much more than that. You were created to do so much more than that. No matter what stage of life you're in, there are things that can help us to live our lives more completely, more fully, more enjoyably. And in order to do that, we have to have a clear filter against expectations and voices. So to wrap up, I have 3 questions for us. First one, is there a change you could make to help you in process of healing? Is there something you need to let go of? Is there a person you need to put some distance between? Is there something you need to add? And we don't want to add 1,000 things, right? Pick one thing. Is there something that we could do that would actually make a difference? And if you can identify that change but are having difficulty making that change, is there a voice or an expectation that's keeping you from doing that? I think there's a good chance that there is. There's this sense that it's just not going to work. But maybe it will. But if there's a voice that's telling you don't even try, does it come from a place of love? And to be crystal clear, love of God as demonstrated by Jesus. A love that is patient, that is sacrificial, and is concerned with your well-being above all other things. That's the filter. That is that next phase in actually really having a healthier part of our lives. That if we build on the things we talked about last week in terms of identifying it, what is that thing that's really got us? Inviting God in, using the tools, but recognizing that we need to make changes as well, and not being afraid to make those. Considering other people's input and advice, but not being crippled by other people's input and advice. That's the things we can do to really start to have healing in our lives.